"Don't move," someone yelled, but I was already past the guardrail before the word finished leaving their mouth. The dock was on fire. Not the whole thing, just the far end where the fuel line had ruptured. But fire doesn't ask permission to spread, and there was a teenager out there on a capsized sailboat with his arm caught somewhere under the hull. Behind me, a woman was screaming his name. Marcus. Marcus. I didn't know either of them. I just knew the tide was coming in fast and the boy wasn't getting free on his own. The strange thing, the thing I still can't quite explain to people who ask, is that 2 hours earlier the only thing I'd wanted in the entire world was for one of my children to answer their phone. My name is Walter Odom. I'm 64 years old, a retired harbor pilot out of Charleston, South Carolina, and until the morning this story starts, I was the kind of man who fixed the porch step himself, instead of asking either of my kids to come by and help. My wife Carol used to tell me that was pride dressed up as independence, and she was probably right about most things, including that. She usually was. Carol had been gone 11 days when I flew home from my sister's place in Ohio, where I'd spent nearly 2 weeks going through the last of our mother's belongings, because grief apparently doesn't wait a respectful interval before it decides to visit a family twice in 1 year. My mother passed in early spring. Carol followed in June, quietly, in her sleep, the kind of ending you'd wish for someone you love if you had any say in the matter, which you never do. I had exactly one suitcase and a folded American flag from my father-in-law's service that my sister insisted I take home with me, because she said it belonged with Carol's things, and Carol's things were mine now, whether I wanted that responsibility or not. I landed at Charleston International a little after 6 in the evening. Before I'd even gotten my bag from the overhead bin, I texted the family group thread, the one with me, my son Dale, my daughter Renee, and Dale's wife Priya, who mostly used it to post pictures of my grandson eating spaghetti. I typed, "Just landed. Any chance one of you is free to grab me?" Knees aren't what they used to be with the suitcase. I sat there rereading it twice before I sent it, because asking for help had never come naturally to me, not once in 64 years, and grief hadn't exactly softened that particular habit yet. Dale answered within a minute. "Can't tonight. Got Ethan's game. Just Uber it, Dad. It's like $15. Renee answered a few minutes after that. "You know Friday traffic by the airport is a nightmare right now, right? Might just be easier for you anyway. Might be easier for me." As if the difficulty in question was traffic, and not the fact that I'd just spent 2 weeks folding my dead mother's cardigans into donation boxes while carrying my dead wife's ashes in my carry-on because I hadn't been able to leave them in Ohio, not even for 11 days, not even for a minute. I could have told them that. I could have said the words out loud, finally, after 11 days of saying I was fine to everyone who asked. Instead, I wrote back, "No problem, don't worry about it," and put the phone face down on my knee, because I understood something in that moment I hadn't fully understood before. You cannot make people show up. You can only decide how you're going to carry it when they don't. Charleston in June is heavy air and long light, and the rideshare app told me 11 minutes, which felt like the kindest lie of my whole week. I wheeled my suitcase out past baggage claim into that thick evening heat, past families reuniting with balloons and homemade signs, past a young Marine getting swept up by his mother right there on the sidewalk, everybody's arms full of somebody, and mine full of a rolling suitcase and a flag I didn't know where to put yet. I walked down toward the marina side lot, where the ride shares picked up, because Carol always said the ocean air settled her nerves better than any waiting room ever could, and some habits you keep even after the person who taught them to you is gone. That's when I heard the woman screaming. The fuel line explosion had knocked 2 of the smaller sailboats loose from their moorings, and one of them had flipped almost entirely, trapping 17-year-old Marcus DeLeon underneath by the arm, his life jacket, the only thing keeping his head above the waterline, and just beyond him, fire crawling along a slick of spilled fuel on the surface of the water, moving toward him slow and then not slow at all. People were on their phones, some were filming. A harbor security guard was yelling into a radio for the fireboat, which I already knew, from 18 years piloting tankers in and out of that exact channel, was going to take 9 minutes minimum to get there, and Marcus DeLeon did not have 9 minutes. I want to be honest about what that moment actually felt like, because I think people romanticize it after the fact in a way that isn't quite true. It wasn't bravery, not the kind you see in movies. It was just that I had spent 18 years learning every current and hazard in that harbor, and my body moved before my mind finished deciding anything, the way it does when knowledge becomes instinct. I dropped my suitcase on the dock, told the woman screaming Marcus's name to get back, and went into the water. It was colder than I expected for June. The current pulled harder near the capsized hull than it should have, which told me the tide had already turned, which meant we had even less time than I'd thought. I got to him and found his arm pinned between the hull and a cleat line that had wrapped twice around his wrist when the boat rolled. Fire doesn't care how experienced you are. It was maybe 30 feet away and closing when I finally got the line free with a rigging knife. Somebody on the dock had the sense to throw down to me. Marcus came up gasping, and I got an arm under him and swam us both away from the hull, just as the fuel line finished its slow crawl toward where we'd been. They pulled us both out near the public boat ramp. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and asked if I had family close by who could come get me, and I told her they were busy tonight, and she gave me a look I didn't examine too closely at the time, though I've thought about it plenty since. Marcus's mother, a woman named Yolanda, wouldn't stop thanking me, wouldn't let go of my hand, actually, until her son was loaded into the ambulance, and even then she turned back and hugged me so hard I felt something in my ribs shift. "You didn't even know him," she kept saying. "You don't even know us." I told her that wasn't really the kind of thing you needed to know somebody for. By the time the ambulance pulled away, there were maybe 30 phones that had caught some part of it, and one of them belonged to a marina employee named Josh, who'd been filming the fire from the start and happened to catch the whole rescue, start to finish, on video that would be viewed 4 million times by the following afternoon. I didn't know any of that yet. I checked into a motel 2 miles from the marina because the roads near my own neighborhood were shut down for the investigation, and I sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, in a room that smelled like carpet cleaner, holding Carol's urn in both hands, and I finally let myself cry the way I hadn't let myself cry in 11 days, not for the fire, not for the cold water, but because there would never again be a voice on the other end of the phone asking if my flight had landed safe. My hands were shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from something further down, something that had been waiting patiently for 11 days for me to finally sit still long enough to feel it. Across town, my son Dale was at his boys' Little League game when his phone started buzzing in his pocket during the 4th inning, first a neighbor, then his own brother-in-law, then a text from 3 different people in the space of 2 minutes, all saying some version of turn on the news. He stepped away from the bleachers to look, and there I was, gray-haired and soaked to the skin, being wrapped in a blanket on a Charleston dock, the chyron underneath reading "Local man pulls teen from burning water." Dale told me later his first thought wasn't pride, it was confusion, because as far as he knew I was still in Ohio, or at the very worst getting into an Uber from the airport like he'd told me to. His second thought, the one that actually made him sit down hard on the bleacher bench, was that the footage clearly showed the airport road signage in the background, which meant I hadn't gone anywhere near an Uber. I'd walked to the marina lot myself, alone, suitcase and all, the same night we'd told him not to worry about it. Renee got the call from her husband's mother of all people, a woman she barely spoke to, who'd seen the story on the 6 o'clock broadcast and recognized my last name from something Renee had posted years earlier. Renee turned on the television, standing in her kitchen with dinner half made, and had to sit down on the floor, actual tile floor, when the anchor mentioned that the man in the footage had, according to neighbors, just returned from burying his wife's ashes after flying home from settling his late mother's estate. She hadn't spared a single thought that whole week for what that particular flight home must have felt like for her father. Alone, both women who'd shaped so much of his life gone within months of each other, and she'd told him traffic might be easier for him anyway. My phone stayed face down on the motel nightstand that whole night. I didn't feel it buzzing against the particle board. I didn't see the 41 missed calls stack up between 8 and midnight, first from Dale, then Renee, then people I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly remembering they had my number. For the first time since Carol's funeral, everybody in my life wanted to know exactly where I was, and I couldn't bring myself to care in the way I probably should have. I slept maybe 3 hours. I woke before dawn, and for a few merciful seconds I forgot. Forgot I was in a motel and not my own bed. Forgot Carol was an urn on a nightstand instead of a voice down the hall. Then I reached for the water glass and knocked it over, reaching past where her side of the bed would have been, and it all came back at once, the way it does every single morning now. Like grief, resets overnight just to make sure you feel the whole weight of it fresh each time. Around 7, there was a knock at the door. It was a young reporter named Angela Mercado, who I'd find out later had tracked down the motel through a source at the fire department and had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable about it. She said she wasn't there to ambush me, she just had a message. Marcus was going to be fine. Some ligament damage in the wrist, nothing that wouldn't heal. And he'd been asking the nurses all night about the man who pulled him out of the water. I laughed for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, a real laugh, and told her I hoped somebody was also telling that boy never to get his arm tangled in a rigging line again. Angela smiled and told me there were reporters camped at the end of my street and asked if I wanted to say anything at all, on or off the record. I asked her for one thing instead. I asked her to find out if my son and daughter had seen the footage yet. She called me back an hour later and said every station in the Tri-County area had run it by then, which meant yes, they knew, and had likely known since the night before. I sat with that for a long while, turning it over. I thought about calling them myself. I thought about a lot of things sitting on that motel bed. What I actually did was ask the front desk for a late checkout and spend the rest of the morning walking along the Battery, past the old cannons and the palmettos, watching the harbor traffic move the way it always had, indifferent to the fact that my whole life had cracked open twice in 1 year while the tide just kept doing what tides do. Meanwhile, Dale and Renee had gone to my house together that morning, using the spare key under the fake rock by the azaleas that I'd honestly forgotten I still kept there. Everything sat exactly as I'd left it 2 weeks earlier. Carol's reading glasses folded on the side table, her cardigan still on the hook by the back door, the one I hadn't been able to bring myself to pack into any of those donation boxes in Ohio, even though it matched every other one I'd folded for my mother. Renee said the quiet in that house felt louder than anything anyone had said to each other in days. While she was straightening the bookshelf, just to give her hand something to do, she found a shoebox tucked behind Carol's old photo albums, one she'd never noticed before, tied shut with a ribbon that had gone stiff with age. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, most addressed simply to Walter, in Carol's handwriting, dated across almost 40 years of marriage, the kind of letters she used to leave for me on nights I was out on the water for days at a time, piloting tankers through the channel. Letters she apparently never stopped writing even once I'd retired and was home every night. I don't think we should read these, Renee said. I think she wrote them so somebody eventually would, Dale answered, though he wasn't entirely sure either. The early ones were ordinary, small complaints about the neighbors, funny stories about toddler Renee refusing to wear shoes for an entire summer. Then one from about 15 years back stopped them cold. Carol had written about the year Dale's contracting business nearly went under, how I'd quietly cashed out nearly all of my pension early to cover his equipment loans, and made her swear never to tell him, because I knew he'd never have accepted the money if he understood where it actually came from. Dale went pale reading it. He told me the company had extra capital that quarter, he said. He told me not to worry about it. Renee turned another page and found an entry about her own years of trying and failing to have a second child. How I'd driven her to appointment after appointment 2 states away, without ever once asking why she never wanted her mother along. How Carol had written that some daughters need their fathers more than they need their mothers to know things at all. Renee had to put the letter down. They kept reading. Entry after entry, year after year. Me taking on extra harbor shifts, dangerous rotations other pilots wouldn't touch. Not for the money exactly, but because Dale's oldest boy needed a surgery insurance wouldn't fully cover. Me putting off retirement 2 extra years so Renee could finish her nursing degree without student loans piling up behind her. Then Renee found an entry from only 6 weeks earlier, the most recent one in the box, and read it aloud, her voice breaking somewhere in the middle. Carol had written about her diagnosis, about how I'd sat with her at every single appointment and never once let her see me afraid, how I'd started sleeping in the recliner beside her hospital bed those last few weeks so she wouldn't wake up alone in the night, how she hoped, if she went first, that her children would understand that my quiet wasn't distance. It was just the only language I'd ever fully trusted. Dale sat down hard on the floor of the hallway, back against the wall, and put his face in his hands. I thought Dad just didn't feel things the way Mom did, he said. So did I, Renee answered. Neither of them had ever once wondered why I still drove a 15-year-old truck, or why I hadn't taken a real vacation since before Renee's wedding, or why I always said things were just fine whenever anybody asked. It turns out believing someone is fine takes far less effort than actually asking them, and far less courage, too. Around noon, Priya arrived with lunch and immediately sensed something had shifted in the house. She read 2 of the letters over Dale's shoulder and sat down on the floor beside him without a word. I told him to Uber it, Dale finally said, staring at nothing. His wife had been gone 11 days, and I told my father to Uber it because I didn't want to miss an inning of Ethan's game. Across town, I was sitting on a bench near White Point Garden, the same spot Carol and I used to walk after Sunday church for 30-some years, when my phone finally rang and I actually answered it. It was Dale. For several long seconds he couldn't say anything at all, just breathing, and then finally, "Dad, please come home." Words I would have given almost anything to hear the night before, arriving now a full day too late to feel the way they should have. I didn't yell at him. I didn't ask what had changed his mind, though by then I had a fairly good idea. I just told him I wasn't ready yet, not to punish him, but because some things need room to breathe before you can hold them without breaking under the weight of it all over again. I spent that whole afternoon walking the Battery a second time, watching the ferries cross toward Fort Sumter, watching tourists take photos by the seawall like nothing in the world had changed, because for them, nothing had. Carol used to say the harbor kept moving whether or not you were ready to keep walking beside it. That afternoon I wasn't entirely sure I still knew how. Angela called again that evening, not for an interview this time, she said. Just to relay that the fire chief wanted to give me a commendation, and so did the mayor's office, and so, apparently, did Marcus's entire extended family, who wanted to throw something she called a proper Charleston cookout in my honor. I told her I wasn't interested in any of it. She said she understood completely, but there was one more thing. Every station in 3 counties was already calling me a hero, and inventing their own reasons for why a 64-year-old man happened to be walking alone through a marina parking lot at 6 in the evening with a suitcase and nobody waiting for him. They don't need the real reason, I said. I think maybe they do, she answered. Being alone is something a lot more people understand than being brave. Then she told me, quietly, that her own grandfather had died alone in a care facility during the worst of the pandemic, and she never got to say goodbye in person, and she'd never once forgiven herself for not driving the 6 hours it would have taken. Neither of us said much after that. I agreed to one interview. No dramatic music, no leading questions, and if I didn't like something she asked, I didn't have to answer it. She agreed to every condition without hesitation. We filmed it the next morning in an empty conference room at the hospital administration building. Just 2 chairs, 1 camera, and a window looking out over the parking structure. She asked why I went into the water instead of waiting for the fireboat. I told her that, after 39 years loving one person and losing her anyway, fear stops carrying the weight it used to. You stop asking whether something is dangerous, and start asking only whether somebody needs you right now, in this exact minute, because minutes are the only thing none of us ever get back once they're spent. Then she asked the question I'd known was coming since the moment she showed up at my motel door. Did my children know I was flying home alone that night? I had every reason in the world, sitting in that chair, to tell the whole truth, to let an entire viewing audience judge my son and daughter the exact way I had judged them alone in that motel room the night before. Instead, I said, they've got full lives, kids, jobs, ball games. I understand it. Angela studied me for a long moment before she spoke again. You don't sound angry, she said. I've had enough sadness this year already, I told her. I wasn't going to go looking for more to carry. That single sentence, they've got full lives, I understand it, ended up everywhere by that evening, clipped and shared and captioned 100 different ways. Not the fire, not the water. That one sentence, because it turned out nearly every person watching recognized somebody in their own life who'd said almost exactly that to them once, or recognized themselves as the one who'd said it to somebody else. One woman commented that her own mother used that exact excuse every single Thanksgiving. Someone else wrote that they'd called their father for the first time in 4 months within an hour of watching it. Dale watched the interview alone in his truck in the school parking lot and had to sit there another 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. Renee watched it from her kitchen table while her youngest, only 6, climbed up into her lap and asked, with the particular honesty only a 6-year-old can manage, why Grandpa was saying such nice things about people who hadn't been very nice to him. Renee didn't have an answer for her. I'm not sure most adults would have either. That night, my porch filled quietly with casserole dishes and handwritten cards from neighbors I hadn't spoken to properly in years. Somebody mowed my lawn without ringing the doorbell. Somebody else had already fixed the loose porch step, the very one I'd been putting off for months, the one Carol used to remind me about every single time she came in from the mailbox. Nobody announced any of it. They just quietly did for me what I'd apparently been quietly doing for this town for close to 2 decades, without anybody making much of a fuss about it either way. When I finally drove home that evening, two folding chairs sat waiting on the porch. Dale in one, Renee in the other, neither of them looking at a phone for once. Neither of us moved for a long moment once I stepped out of the truck. Dale stood first and came down the steps to carry my suitcase in for me, and it struck me, walking behind him, that the last time he'd carried a bag of mine, he'd been maybe 10 years old, small enough that he'd had to drag it more than carry it. Renee said she'd made coffee using Carol's recipe, the one with the extra scoop and the pinch of cinnamon, and it didn't come out quite right, and we both laughed about that on the porch, the first real laugh either of us had managed since the funeral. Inside, the kitchen counter was covered in foil-wrapped dishes from people I barely remembered meeting at church potlucks over the years. Dale finally said it out loud, that they'd found the letters, all of them, and asked if I'd let them find that box on purpose. I told him I hadn't planned it, but I also wasn't surprised it happened the way it did. Some things belonged to their mother, and it was never mine to keep hidden from her children forever. We sat at the kitchen table, where Carol had hosted 39 Thanksgivings. No television on, no phones out, just coffee going cold in front of 3 people finally willing to say the harder things out loud instead of around each other. Dale asked why I'd never told him about the pension money. I told him that helping him wasn't supposed to become one more thing he had to feel guilty about carrying. Renee asked why I'd never once mentioned driving her to those appointments, meant anything more to me than just being available. I told her Carol had wanted her to keep her privacy through all of that, nothing more complicated than that. Then Dale asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since he first watched the interview. Why hadn't I told the truth on camera? Why hadn't I let the whole world see exactly what we'd said to him the night his wife's ashes came home with him on a plane? I told him public embarrassment doesn't heal a private wound, and that Carol never once believed in tearing somebody down just to prove a point in front of strangers. Accountability, she used to say, ought to lead somewhere useful. It shouldn't just leave a person standing there broken with nowhere left to go. Renee asked quietly if I'd been angry that night at the airport. I told her of course I had been, angrier than I'd let myself feel in years. She said I hadn't sounded it at all on camera. I told her 39 years of marriage teaches a man that speaking while you're still furious just hands you a second mess to clean up come morning. A few days later, the 3 of us drove out to the small memorial garden near the church where we'd scattered a portion of Carol's ashes, exactly the spot she'd asked for, overlooking a little pond she used to say reminded her of the farm she grew up on. Dale apologized to a patch of grass and a small stone marker, like she could actually hear him, and for all any of us really know, maybe she could. Renee said she'd forgotten how much I'd quietly carried for both of them across all these years, without ever once setting the weight down where they could see it. I told them most of raising children is teaching them how to walk, and the hardest lesson still left after that is teaching them how to walk back towards somebody once they've drifted. Dale broke down completely there by the pond, and it wasn't the quick, stiff hug grown sons give their fathers out of habit at holidays. It was the kind of hug a frightened boy gives when he suddenly understands exactly how close he came to losing the one person who'd been quietly holding the whole family together the entire time nobody was looking. In the weeks that followed, Dale started showing up most Saturday mornings with 2 coffees, no particular reason given, just because he wanted to. Renee came by Wednesday evenings now with a casserole that never quite tasted like Carol's, and admitted more than once she was missing some ingredient she couldn't name. I told her the ingredient was probably just time, and Carol always said that one wasn't optional no matter how badly you wanted to skip past it. My grandson Ethan wandered into the garage one Saturday afternoon and asked if I'd teach him how to fix the leak in his bike tire himself instead of just fixing it for him. We spent 2 hours on it, and when he finally got the patch to hold, he looked prouder than I'd seen him look in a long while, and I told him that most things worth having take longer than you want them to, people included. About a month after all of it, the fire department asked if I'd speak at a community water safety event down at the marina where it all happened. I almost said no, same as I'd said no to nearly everything else. Then I remembered something Carol used to tell me, that once your worst week stops being only your own, it starts belonging to whoever needs to hear it next. So I said yes. Near the end of it, a woman in the crowd asked what actually made me go into that water instead of waiting for the professionals to arrive. I told her my wife spent 39 years quietly teaching me that when somebody you love needs you, you stop waiting around for somebody else to be the one who shows up. The real mistake most families make isn't one big dramatic betrayal, Not usually. It's 1,000 small postponements, an unanswered call, a canceled visit, the quiet, comfortable assumption that there will always be another chance to make things right later, when the truth is sometimes there just isn't. If there's one thing I genuinely ask you to do tonight, not just think about, but actually do, it's this. Call your father. Call your mother. Call whichever one of them you've been meaning to call and kept putting off for reasons that felt important at the time and won't mean a thing to you later. Not next week. Tonight. Ask yourself honestly whether there's somebody in your own life you've quietly assumed will simply always be there whenever you finally get around to it. I'd love to hear your answer in the comments, truly. Comment 1 if you think I was right to protect my son and daughter on camera instead of telling the whole story. Comment 2 if you think the world deserved the whole truth that night. And comment 3 if you're honestly torn about it. Because I still am some days, if I'm being completely honest with you. Tell me where you're watching this from tonight, and what time it is where you are right now, because it still amazes me, every single time, how many different corners of the country end up sitting with me in this same quiet moment. And if any part of this reminded you of your own family, of your own father, of your own quiet sacrifices nobody's ever fully noticed, I'd love to hear that too. If this one meant something to you tonight, stay a little while longer and consider subscribing, because I've got more stories like this one about the quiet things we carry for the people we love and never once think to mention. Until next time, take care of yourself, and don't wait for a headline to remind you who's been carrying you all along.